This video will provide an overview of Philly education and the role of young professionals. My name is Claire Robertson-Kraft, and I'm the Associate Director of Operation Public Education, which is a policy research organization based out of the University of Pennsylvania.
And my name is Danielle Wolf, and I'm a Social Impact Fellow with the Center for High Impact Philanthropy, which is also based at the University of Pennsylvania.
And we are both also members of PhillyCORE Leaders, which is a coalition of rising education leaders committed to building a more positive and collaborative education community in Philadelphia. This overview has three parts. We will start by providing an overview of the current situation in Philly education by looking at where we are now. Then we will spend some time briefly looking back at where we've been over the past decade to get a sense of how we've gotten to where we are today. And finally, we'll close by looking forward at the role of young professionals in supporting Philly education moving forward. So starting with the current situation, where are we now? As you can see from this chart, from 2002 to 2011, there's been a steady increase in students' performance on the state standardized tests, the PSSA, but there was a significant drop in 2012. So less than 50% of students in Philadelphia public schools are performing at the proficient level. As you can see from this chart, the district's on-time graduation rate has been around 60% over the past decade and increased slightly to 64% over the past 2 years. However, despite this growth, only 10.3% of students who enter high school in Philadelphia graduate from college in 8 years. And as this chart demonstrates, there is a significant discrepancy by subgroups. So what is the district doing to address this significant student need? It's recently released the second iteration of its Action Plan 2.0, which has 6 overarching goals listed here. In order to implement this action plan effectively, the district has requested an additional $320 million. So let's explore now where the possible sources of funding are.
So the School District of Philadelphia, like most school districts across the country, draws its resources from both federal and state funds, as well as local property tax revenue. Unfortunately, here in Pennsylvania, there's been a disinvestment in education at the state level. In 2011-2012, there were statewide education cuts, which caused Philadelphia to lose almost $300 million of state revenue. 2013 state budget did increase funding for education slightly, but did not make up for the net losses. And currently here in Pennsylvania, we only spend 35% of the general fund on education, while the average across the U.S. for state spending is about 44%. So Pennsylvania is far below that. This chart shows you, it's a little difficult to see, but you can see from FY 1992 all the way to FY 2012. These are the percentage growth increases in spending at the state level in education. And 2011-2012 was the first drastic decrease in spending. You can't see it. There's a tiny little bar increase in 2012, but overall, it was a pretty significant decrease that we saw for the first time in over a decade. And on top of the pie being smaller overall for education at the state level, there's also an issue with the funding that does come from the state being distributed inequitably. We are one of only 3 states in the U.S. that does not have a funding formula in place, and that creates considerable inequity in the level of spending per pupil across districts. So what happens is that low-income districts have to tax themselves at a higher property tax rate than wealthier districts in order to generate enough revenue to operate their schools. So for example, in Lower Merion, which is a school district right outside of Philadelphia in a wealthier suburb, they spend about $22,000 per pupil, while in Philadelphia we only spend $13,000, and our tax rate for property tax is higher. And on top of there being some disparities of state funding, there's also a gap at the local level in spending on education. This past summer of 2013, the Philadelphia School District had to put a doomsday budget into place to close the $304 million budget deficit they were experiencing, and that meant that almost 3,800 educators received layoff notices. The city has pledged to raise an additional $153 million next year, but that falls short of the district's request of $320 million. Mayor Nutter's budget plan relies on the state legislature to give the city permission to raise both the cigarette and the sales tax to generate additional revenue for the school district.
So to understand how we got to where we are today, let's take a moment to look back on where we've been over the past decade. Philadelphia is a national example of what's called a portfolio management model, which experiments with different types of schools. In Philadelphia, there are 4 key types of schools to know about. The first is your traditional public schools. Secondly are charter public schools, which get public funding but are privately managed by specific organizations. And in order to get into a charter, parents submit applications and then their students are chosen from a lottery. Third, there are Renaissance charter public schools, which get public funding but are privately operated. The difference with Renaissance charter schools is that they take over an existing neighborhood school and conduct a turnaround. As part of the turnaround, the staff has to reapply for their jobs and only 50% can be rehired. So it's a very dramatic process of turnaround for these schools. And then finally, there are privately managed and funded schools. So if we look back to 2000, when David Hornback was the superintendent of the Philadelphia School District, you can see the roots of the portfolio management model. You'll notice that in 2000, the majority of schools were still regular district managed schools, but in 1997, charter legislation passed, which led to the creation of charter schools in Philadelphia. And at that time, there were a small number of charter schools and a small number of schools that were contracted out to private providers as well. In 2002, there was a funding battle with the state, which ended in the state takeover of the school district of Philadelphia. At that time, Paul Vallis came in to serve as the superintendent, and there was a sea change in the type of schools in Philadelphia. Some schools were contracted out to some low-performing schools were contracted out to for-profit and nonprofit organizations. And there were also expanded resources provided to 16 low-performing schools that were district managed that were showing progress. In 2008, Arlene Ackerman became the superintendent of the Philadelphia School District, and she terminated the majority of the privately managed contracts with the exception of several alternative schools. During that time, the traditional charter sector continued to grow, and finally, she launched a new initiative, the Renaissance School Initiative, which experimented with the turnaround model that I shared before. So who are the key players now? The School District of Philadelphia is now operated by Superintendent Dr. William Hite, who's been here since 2012, and his deputy superintendent is Paul Kine. We're still under state takeover in Philadelphia, and so the oversight is provided by the School Reform Commission, which has 3 members appointed by the governor and 2 members appointed by the mayor. The chair of the School Reform Commission is former Councilman Bill Green. So what's happened in the past couple of years under Dr. Hite's tenure? Given the financial crisis that Danielle shared, the district closed 24 traditional public schools in the 2013-2014 school year. No typical charters were granted expansions for the 2013-2014 school year, but the Renaissance charters, the turnaround model that I shared before, are growing by a few schools every year. Also under Dr. Hite's tenure, the new office has been launched, the Office of New School Models, which has proposed 3 new innovative non-selective district high schools for the following year. The U School, which will focus on design thinking, the Link, which will focus on global leadership and have an inquiry-based approach to learning, and finally Building 21, which focuses on the learner as designer. So looking forward, where do we go from here, and what is the role of the young professional in supporting Philly education? A recent Pew report demonstrated that from 2006 to 2012, for the first time, Philadelphia's population grew considerably, and the 20 to 34-year-old demographic, so our demographic of young professionals, was responsible for really driving that population growth. So we have a couple of key assets to build upon. First, young professionals bring an energy and commitment to supporting Philly education. Second, there's no shortage of existing resources or organizations here in Philadelphia that are really committed to supporting the Philadelphia School District. In fact, there's over 1,600 registered nonprofits in the region. So there's a real potential to think about how to connect those organizations and this increase of individuals to commit to supporting Philadelphia public education. And finally, Philadelphia is often known as the city of neighborhoods. And so there's a way to get engaged on a real local level now. So what can you do? First, it's really important to stay informed. So here's a set of resources that you can use to stay up to speed on what's happening in Philly education, as well as a number of people to follow on social media that are providing up-to-date, minute-by-minute coverage of the key issues. And secondly, you can get engaged. So if you're a teacher that's looking to get more involved, Teachers Lead Philly is focusing on fostering teacher leadership, as well as getting teachers more engaged in local policy issues. PhillyCORE Leaders, of which both Danielle and I are members, is building a coalition of rising education leaders here in Philadelphia to really work towards transformational change. And finally, you can get involved in your local school. So the Great Philly Schools website listed here is a place to go to learn what your neighborhood school is. And if you're interested in getting more connected with the local school group, you can reach out to PhillyCORE Leaders. And most importantly, you can participate in the political process by voting. So thank you so much for listening and for your interest in Philly education. If you'd like to learn more, please feel free to reach out to us at phillycoreleaders@gmail.com.
Thank you all.